Baby, wouldn't it be nice if we both spoke the same language? I could understand your troubles and you know mine, and we could be together all the time if we both spoke the same language. Baby, no sería lindo si nos dos habláramos la misma lengua. Podría entender tus problemas y sabrías los míos.
Hello and welcome to Whoever You Thought You Were, You're a Jew. The TV show designed to remove our obsession with this and replace it with an obsession with this. This is our fourth show. It's called Genetics of Jewishness. Where is David now? Today we're going to continue exploring the meaning of our title, Whoever You Thought You Were, You're a Jew. What is a Jew anyway? In our introductory show, I proposed to you that the only satisfactory definition of the word was the definition given by Jesus when he said, "Whosoever shall do the will of our Father which is in heaven." Do the will of our Father which is in heaven. The same as my brother, sister, and mother. What I'm suggesting to you is that believing in God and doing His will is the whole essence of Judaism. Note that there's no heredity or genetics in this definition. I know that a lot of people think the Jews are a race. Well, they're not. The purpose of today's show is to prove that to you. We're going to start by considering the identity of the Jewish Messiah. Then we'll proceed to the body of the Jewish people in general. All the ancient Hebrew prophets predicted the coming of a Messiah, or in Hebrew, Moshiach, an exalted man with near godly powers, who would save the world by executing justice against the wicked, and who would set up a godly empire which would last forever. The Jewish Messiah and the Christian Christ are one and the same, except for the disagreement about whether Jesus' earthly ministry should count as a first coming or not. Muslims call the Messiah Mahdi. All three of the world's monotheistic religions, therefore, share a basic belief in a coming Messiah. Now, the Bible says that Messiah will be a descendant of David, the greatest of the kings of ancient Israel. Therefore, it's hardly a small matter to ask the following question. Where is the so-called House of David now? Most of the descendants of David were scattered far and wide by the enemies of Israel. So when a Messiah arises from the house of David, how will we recognize him? For example, if a Korean man like Sun Myung Moon is proclaimed Messiah by his followers, is it right for us to feel contempt solely because of his skin color and Oriental features? Or might David have penetrated into the Oriental race by now? Let's do some genetics. In this drawing, we show a very, very simple mathematical formula. Man plus woman yields baby. I guess you've heard that one before. Now, in this example, we've got some names. David, Bathsheba, who was one of David's many wives, and Solomon, his most famous of sons. Now, I want you to address your attention to the vertical lines in these boxes. We're going to have a lightning-fast course in genetics. All living things are made up of billions of tiny cells. These three boxes represent the cells. Within each of your cells, all of your human characteristics are carried in little things called genes, which are made of the chemical DNA, which I guess most of you have also heard of. Huge numbers of these genes are packed together in big hodgepodges called chromosomes. These vertical lines represent the chromosomes. All chromosomes come as pairs. There are over 20 such pairs, or 40 some odd individual chromosomes in total. But to simplify the drawing, I've drawn only one pair in each cell. You'll have to imagine the others. Now concerning these pairs of chromosomes, in every instance one member of the pair came from the father and the other one from the mother. So this one came from David, and this one came from Bathsheba. The reason I'm showing you this is because I want you to understand that this guy, Solomon, who's a lawful, legitimate heir to David's throne, is genetically only half David. The other half of his DNA came from his mother. Therefore, what we've just learned is that according to the laws of inheritance, a man needn't be genetically 100% David to be a 100% lawful heir of David. In fact, even the very closest possible descendant of David, namely his son, is really, chemically, he's only 50% David. The other 50% comes from his mother, Bathsheba. But from the point of view of lawful inheritance, he's a 100% lawful heir and a 100% full-fledged member of the so-called House of David. Now, the next thing I want to show you is how David's genetic material gets diluted and watered down through the generations. We've seen that the genetic material is contained in chromosomes, and I told you that chromosomes were big hodgepodges packed with things called genes. A gene is a small piece of DNA which controls one single genetic trait, like eye color. The scientists have tried to count them. According to most estimates, all the characteristics which make up a live human being are contained in a grand total of 100,000 genes. We've seen that even David's first-generation descendant, Solomon, was only half David from the genetic point of view, the other half being from his mother. What further dilution of David's genes will we see as we look from generation to generation? Here's a chart with a lot of numbers, but what it shows is really very simple. Look at the top line. Here's David himself. Like every human being, he has 100,000 genes, and he is 100% David. He's nobody but himself. Now look at the next generation. We've already seen that even his world-famous son Solomon was chemically only half David. So if David had 100,000 genes, Solomon is only going to get half of them, or 50,000. The other 50,000 are going to come from his mother, Bathsheba. What happens in subsequent generations? Well, it's easy to see that Solomon's children, or David's grandchildren, will be only half again as David-like or Davidic as Solomon was. In other words, the grandchildren, or the descendants of the third generation, will each have only 25,000 of David's original 100,000 genes. Now look what happens as time progresses. In subsequent generations, the number of Davidic genes drops precipitously by halves, 12,000, 6,000, 3,000, 1,500, etc., all the way down here, where in the 17th generation we're down to 1. Now I want you to think carefully about this 17th generation, because here the average heir of the House of David has only one single Davidic gene left. Like all other humans, he still has a total of 100,000 genes, but 99,999 of them came from other people, and just this one little gene came from David. Now remember that his children will get only half of his DNA, since the other half must come from the mother. But a gene can be divided in half. In practice, what this means is that half of his children will get this single Davidic gene, and the other half of the children will get no Davidic genes at all. It's like this. Remember that all genes exist as pairs, one from the father and the other from the mother. The children will get either the David gene or the other, but not both. Suppose the two cups in front of me represent two children. One of them might get the David gene, and the other, and that means that he'll be genetically just like his father with that one single gene of David. The other child, however, might get the other, non-Davidic gene. If you're following what I'm saying, that you understand that this child will have absolutely no Davidic genes at all. These other children are still 100% lawful heirs and full-fledged members of the so-called House of David, yet they have absolutely no genetic material whatsoever from David. And we ought to point out that the situation continues to deteriorate genetically as subsequent generations come and go. Over 100 generations have come and gone since the days of King David, and the vast majority of his heirs today have absolutely no genetic material whatsoever from him. They're heirs in name only. Genetically, they have no more relationship to David than they do to Goliath. And that's a fact. Now let's look at the other side of the coin. We've seen that the world is filled with genetically watered down Davids. But genetically watered down though they may be, they are still the lawful heirs of the house of David. Therefore, we'd like to know just exactly how many such Davids are there today. Let's return for a moment to the original David and one of his wives. In this drawing, we show what happens when David has two children. We've given them real names from the Bible, Solomon and Absalom. Notice again, as we pointed out before, that both Solomon and Absalom each get one chromosome from their father David, that's the black one, and one from their mother, that's the gray one. Now what I want to impress upon you is this. Even though the boys are genetically only 50% David, there are twice as many of them. This is what I mean. The number of Davids is doubled. Look, in the first generation there was only one David. The father was a David, but the mother was not. But in the next generation, all the children are Davids, so that the number of Davids increases in each generation. If the population grows, then the number of Davids increases even faster. But even if two parents leave behind only two children, so that the population remains constant at 2, the number of Davids will double in each and every generation. Now let's ask ourselves, how many Davids are there today? David lived about 1000 BC. The Bible makes mention of 10 wives and concubines, and in the book of Chronicles there are statements implying that there were numerous others who were not named. It's therefore virtually certain that he had at least 100 children. It hardly matters, because what you're going to see is that the number of Davids grows so rapidly that it almost doesn't matter how few you start with. Look, in the first generation, let's figure there's 100 sons and daughters. Even if we assume that there's no growth in the population, look what happens in the next generation. The number of David doubles, as we just saw. Again, it's not because we're presuming a population increase. It's simply because in every generation only one of the parents is a David, but all the children are. Now in the next generation there's a further doubling. So now we're up to 400, then 800, then 1600 in the next generation, 3200, 6400, all the way down to the bottom of the chart, which is the year 600 BC, at which time the absolute dead minimum estimate of the number of Davids has grown to 400,000. And believe me, that's a minimum estimate. The actual number could have been 1 million or more. What I'm trying to tell you is that in the year 600 BC, there were probably the better part of 1 million descendants of David running around Israel. And what happened in 600 BC? If you tuned into last week's show, then you know that practically the entire population of ancient Israel was driven into exile at that time and scattered to the 4 corners of the world. We've just learned 2 important things. In the first place, the number of Davids in 600 BC was rapidly approaching the same number as the total population of Israel. This doesn't mean that there were 2 different populations, one group a David population and the other group everybody else. What it means is that David's genes got mixed in with everybody else through countless marriages into countless families, so that after a while, almost everybody had a drop or 2 of David's blood in him. The second important thing we can now see is that the diaspora resulted in possibly as many as 1 million Davids getting driven to the ends of the earth. At all these various locations, each of the Davids then proceeded to insert these very same genes into the gene pools of all these new countries. And 100 more generations have passed since then. If you're following what I'm saying, then you're perhaps starting to realize something very important. In the world today, it's certain that intermarriage has resulted in many, many people becoming the hereditary descendants of King David. I actually believe that the majority of people living in the world today even in inbred populations, are the lawful descendants and heirs of the house of David, even though there's hardly a man alive today who has so much as a single gene from David's original chromosomes. There are two ways to look at this. The first is to dismiss the biblical prophecy of the rise of the house of David as pure mythological rubbish, of no relevance in today's sophisticated world of high-tech murder and thievery. The second is to understand that God has made us all descendants of David, so that the blessings of the Messianic age can be for every man, woman, and child, and not just for the tiny minority of people who belong to synagogues and call themselves Jews. Are you starting to understand now why I call this show, Whoever You Thought You Were, You're a Jew? And why I keep pushing this quote from Jesus, "Whoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven," as being the only real definition of what a Jew is. There's no Jewish race. There's only people who believe and who love and desire God, versus people who doubt and who love and desire money. And in the future, everybody's going to have to make a decision between these two. If you still think there's a Jewish race, you're going to be very surprised at what you hear next. Everything I'm going to say is based on this wonderful book. It's called The 13th Tribe by Arthur Koestler. This book pretty much proves that there's no such thing as a Jewish race. It's about the origin of the so-called Ashkenazi Jews, who constitute the great majority of Jews in the world today. Ashkenazis hail from Russia and Eastern Europe. It's commonly taught by Jewish historians that they originated in Western and Central Europe, and that multitudes of them fled to Eastern Europe to escape persecution. But, as Arthur Koestler shows, there's a problem. You see, close examination of historical records does not bear out any such mass migrations. Furthermore, I'm an Ashkenazi. What's this business with the blonde hair and blue eyes? A lot of us Ashkenazis have the physical characteristics of native Eastern Europeans. All the native populations of the countries surrounding Israel are people with dark complexions. So what's with the blonde hair? Let's look at some history. In AD 710, the armies of Islam invaded Africa and Spain. Then they crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into France, where, in the year AD 732, they were turned back by the French. I was taught in elementary social studies that if the French had not won that war, we'd probably all be Muslims today. What they don't teach in public school is that the Muslims tried to invade Europe through the eastern end also. But they couldn't get through Byzantium, so they tried to sneak into Europe by going around through the nation that we now call Russia. When they went past the Caucasus Mountains, unfortunately for their plans, they encountered an army of fierce barbarians called the Khazars, or the Khuzari. Since most Americans can't pronounce the guttural Khazar, I'll pronounce that name the way it's spelled in English. Kazar. The Khazars beat back the Muslims in a series of bloody wars involving armies as large as 200 to 300,000 men on each side. These wars went on for over 100 years. Finally, in AD 737, the Arab invasions petered out and peace prevailed. At that point, Bulan, the king of the Khazars, decided that he wanted to have a religion too. There's an amusing story about what happened next. According to legend, King Bulan invited a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim to his court. Each of the three gave a strong pitch for his own religion, and Bulan couldn't decide which one to choose. So he sent all three out. Then he called back the Christian by himself. He said, "I've decided not to become a Christian, but which one of these other two religions should I choose?" Without hesitation, the Christian began ranting and railing against Islam and said, "If you can't be a Christian, then without a doubt, be a Jew." Then King Bulan sent out the Christian and called in the Muslim. A similar scene transpired. The Muslim began ranting and railing against Christianity. Then he said, "If you can't be a Muslim, then without a doubt, be a Jew." Well, that settled things for King Bulan. In effect, all three were telling him the same thing: be a Jew. So he converted. This extraordinary conversion took place in AD 740. Subsequently, for 500 years, Russia was a Jewish nation. If you don't believe it, look it up in any encyclopedia. The Khazars were the supreme masters of all Russia, from the Ural Mountains all the way into parts of Poland, Hungary, Austria, and the Czech Republic. Then a terrible thing happened. The Vikings invaded. Remember the Muslim invasions from the south? Well, at about this time, a horrible mirror image invasion of Europe came down from the north. Whereas the Muslims brought religion, culture, and civilization wherever they went, the Vikings brought nothing whatsoever. They only killed, plundered, and destroyed. They never gave. The Viking dream was to sail down the rivers of Russia to the Black Sea, where the city of Byzantium lay. Unfortunately for them, they, like the Muslims before them, discovered that the Russian Khazar Jews were a formidable barrier. Furthermore, Khazars, with the financial support of the Christians and Muslims, who'd suddenly become their friends, built a major fortress called Sarkel on the Don River, which blocked Viking access to the Black Sea for almost a century. But during that century, gradually from the north down, the Vikings conquered and settled permanently in the Khazar cities. Finally, in AD 965, they overran the Jewish fortress at Sarkel, which gave them open access to the Black Sea and to Byzantium. Then an amazing thing happened. All of a sudden, the Vikings decided to convert to Christianity. No sooner had they done so than the Byzantine Christians suddenly changed sides. Now the Vikings were their friends. They no longer had any use for the Jews, who they actually hated all along. So the Byzantine and Viking Christians together turned against the Jews. And although it took them 300 years to get the job done, they began rooting Judaism out of Russia. So the Khazars totally ruled Russia and Eastern Europe for about 200 years, and they remained a major influence for another 300 years after that. Who were these people who were the backbone of Russian life for 500 years? The Khazar story actually starts in 372 AD, when the Huns began their invasions into Europe. After the death of Attila the Hun in 453, the Huns disappear from history without a trace. It seems that the Huns originally arose in Russia. Most historians who ventured an opinion on the subject have concluded that the Khazars, who spoke a language similar to that of the Huns, either were the Huns themselves or else were an ethnically related tribe operating in the same area. At the bottom of this timeline, we see the words Polish Royal Charter. At about this time in history, hundreds of thousands of Jews suddenly started to show up in Poland. Where did they come from? The principal conclusion of this book, author Kessler's The 13th Tribe, is that the number of Ashkenazi Jews who moved to Poland was about the same as the number of Khazar Jews who left Russia. That number was in the hundreds of thousands, and it's entirely impossible to account for such a large Polish Jewish population by so-called migrations from the West. Why? Mainly because there were no mass migrations of Western European Jews to Poland, which have ever been satisfactorily documented. What makes this so important is that the Polish Jews are the Ashkenazis, and the Ashkenazis account for over 90% of the Jews in the world today. What we're saying is that 90% of the Jews in the world today may not be descendants of King Solomon at all. They may in fact be direct descendants of Attila the Hun. This history is embarrassing to all three parties involved, namely the Russians, who used to be Jews, the Poles, who used to like Jews, and the Jews themselves, who apparently used to be Huns. Because it's an embarrassment, the history is simply ignored and it's never discussed. That's why we're doing this TV series, Whoever You Thought You Were, You're a Jew. So we can present to you the, Ignored Truths of History, which is our subtitle. Please tune in next week. At that time, we're going to talk about Jesus Christ.
Focus on the one thing that I'm sure of. Baby, wouldn't it be nice if we both spoke the same language? both spoke the same.